Hello, and welcome to AP Environmental Science. Today I want to talk about population dynamics. How do populations change over time, and what causes them to change, and then what are the characteristics of populations that we are interested in? Now, before we talk about that, I just want to remind you of the hierarchical organization of ecology, which is we have an individual, and then individuals are part of a population. A population is a group, all of the same species. Then lots of populations interacting with each other is called a community. When you put that community into the abiotic system and you are looking at the relationships and the interactions between the living and non-living things, among the non-living things, among the living things, that's an ecosystem. And then all of the ecosystems together are the biosphere. And really, the organization is about interactions. So when we talk about population ecology and dynamics, there are some things that we are interested in. And one, population, right? How do we measure populations? And then what factors affect a population size? How do populations grow? How do the characteristics of populations influence species and species behavior? What are those reproductive strategies and how do they affect population? And then of course, not today, but later we'll be talking about the human population. That is next video notes. So how are population measured? Well, you can measure the straight up population, right? Which is actually the second bullet here. Or you can measure the population density. So really what's more interesting to us is the population density. So in order to get the population density, you obviously have to have the number of individuals in a population, which if you look at this photo could be pretty challenging if you're just going to count all of them. And also if you look at this photo, what's interesting is they're little clusters of population. They're not evenly distributed, right? And so the way that populations are distributed are really going to affect the impact that they have on the environment, right? So that's why population density is so important. But back to this counting all the individuals in the population. You do need the number of individuals. A better way to do it is to estimate by sampling. Okay, so when we talk about population size, there are 4 variables that determine how big a population will be and how it changes over time. Which one of these 4 things is not actually part of population size? Well, births, deaths, and immigration are all things that will determine the size of your population. Lifespan, on the other hand, does not. So, what we're really talking about are birth, death, and migration. And migration comes in 2 types: immigration, where you come into a population, emigration, where you are exiting a population. And a closed population really only, like the Earth, right? The Earth has a closed population. And so we only are interested in birth and death because there's no migration off or onto the planet. Now, when we are talking about populations, say within a country, right? This is an open population. And open populations take into account birth and immigration on the one side and death and emigration on the other side. And we are going to be working with this concept a whole lot more in the next couple of classes. So we'll come back to that later on. But this is true for all populations. So you've got closed populations, open populations. An open population is real, right? That's where you have real growth, right? Or real decline. When you're talking about a closed population and you're only taking into account births and deaths, that's natural. Okay, so let's get back to this population density thing, because population density is more interesting to us than just straight up population. You want to know how many and where. Okay, and this could be measured in several ways. Like I said, you could count all of the individuals, but that could be really hard for a large and or dispersed population. Or a large population of very small things, right? So there's all kinds of issues. So there's really two viable ways that we do this. We can do a sample plot and take a bunch of straight counts in a small section of a large area, right? Now, if you're talking about figuring out what kind of plants live in a field, you could pick like 10 1 meter by 1 meter squares randomly throughout the field, and then you can figure out how many of each thing are in those, and then you can get a good estimate by taking account, okay, so if I have 5 of this thing in, on average in, 1 square meter, and I've got 1,000 square meters, then I have 5,000 of these things, okay, and that's an estimate. The other thing that you can do, because population is not evenly distributed most of the time, is you can do what's called a mark and recapture method. And so in this case, you figure out the number by marking a couple of individuals from the population. So you trap a couple of individuals, you catch them, you mark them, and then you let them go, and then you capture a second time, and then you look at how many of those were recaptured, right? So you have the first population that you've tagged, then the second population that you've caught, and how many of those individuals were tagged, okay? And that's called the mark and recapture method. It's very, very common. As you can see, here are a bunch of little marked guys. Okay, so one of the things when you're talking about population density is, what is the actual pattern of density? Do you have a clumped pattern like you have with humans? Think about cities, right? Do you have a uniform distribution? Think about trees. Or do you have a random distribution? In this case, we see these cute little ferns here. Also these cute little penguins. I'm also trying to give you a second example. All right, so here's your first mini quiz question. Considering the 3 dispersion patterns, uniformed, clumped, and random, which are humans most likely to conform to in the settlement patterns? Well, I already told you, and that is clumped, right? Think about cities. So, okay, population growth models. The other thing that we're really interested in is how populations change over time, what causes them to grow, and how do they grow in terms of patterns, right? And so there are 2 basic population growth models. There's the exponential growth model and there's the logistic growth model. And the exponential growth model, it's called a J-shaped curve. This is what happens when you have ideal conditions. That every individual in the population gets everything that they need. They can have as many babies as they possibly can, and the population just grows. Then it's described by the equation: growth rate is equal to the intrinsic rate of increase, or an organism's maximum capacity to reproduce, times its population size or density. And when you start looking at intrinsic rates of increase, if you have a high intrinsic rate of increase, you're going to have a rapidly growing population. Low rate of increase or growth rate is slow growth. No growth rate, this is where the number of offspring eventually is equivalent to the number of parents, right? This is 0 population growth. And then if you have fewer offspring than parents, you're going to have negative growth. And we're going to talk about all of these when we start talking about the human population. All right, so what about logistic growth? Logistic growth is actually more likely because a population can't grow forever. At some point, it's going to level off. And so growth is slowed by population limiting factors. And we'll talk about those factors in a little bit. You've got density dependent and density independent factors, and we'll come back to that. But eventually you're going to reach something called carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is the maximum population size that an environment can support. And so you add to that equation the growth rate, growth is equal to the intrinsic rate of growth times the population. You're going to add to that the carrying capacity minus the total population divided by the carrying capacity, and that is going to level off that curve. And as you approach that curve, what happens? So with what kind of growth, or with what, the growth rate will decrease as the population gets larger. Well, this is going to be exponential growth, right? Your growth rate, as your population gets higher and higher and higher, fewer offspring can actually survive in each generation, and so you're going to have slower and slower and slower growth until you eventually level off, and that is logistic growth, right? That's kind of the definition. So because you have this leveling off, it means that you have competition, right? And so there are a couple of ways to deal with this. There are the opportunistic species versus the competitive species, right? And so if you have a large number of smaller offspring, those offspring are basically tiny adults. These are the R-selected species. You have a bunch of them, and so then only a certain number survive. Most of them die off at that carrying capacity. Now, there is another method, and that is to have a couple of babies, but invest a lot of care into them, so you can actually have fewer, but most of them survive to adulthood. So on the R-selected species, you have lots of tiny offspring. The parents don't do anything for them, right? And most of the offspring die before they reach their reproductive age. Now, K-selected species, on the other hand, right, have those big babies that they have to take a lot of care of, but most of them survive. Now, what this results in is that R-selected species typically reproduce at a very early age. They may have only one set of babies, like they may lay, like cockroaches will lay thousands of eggs. They may have multiple reproductive events. That actually is really not going to affect this. It's the number that they have in one event that's the important part. Now here's the other thing. R-selected species tend to be small, K-selected species tend to be bigger. R-selected species do really well in unstable environments, right? They are very adaptable, and so because there are lots of them, they've got variety. They usually have short generation times and they're small. They're pretty adaptable, whereas K-selected species are much more vulnerable in an unstable or changing environment, and so they're more likely to become extinct when things change. R-selected species model more, well, let's put it this way. They have a higher population growth rate at first, really high, and they can actually increase their numbers in a relatively short period of time. But let's also keep in mind that they will level off at the carrying capacity. If they exceed carrying capacity, they're going to come back down to it. But they'll reach carrying capacity a whole lot faster than the K-selected species. The population size is going to get really big and then smaller and then really big and smaller. Whereas the K-selected species, because they have a lower population growth rate, they have a smaller number of offspring, they really hang out right around carrying capacity. Okay, R-selected species tend to be generalists, K-selected species tend to be specialists. This is relating to food acquisition. Generalists typically will get their resources from lots of different places. Specialists really do kind of one sort of thing, think hummingbirds, right? R-selected species, though, have a really low ability to compete. You either kind of survive or you don't, whereas K-selected species, there are fewer of them, but they are competing, right? And then we'll talk about succession later on. Okay, so generally a species with a high intrinsic rate of increase will do what? It'll be a K-selected species, it'll reproduce late in life, it'll be a specialist, or it'll produce many small offspring. Remember, high growth rates are associated with R-selected species, and R-selected species produce many small offspring. Now, we can describe this life history, and I'll explain life histories in just a second, with a survivorship curve, right? A survivorship curve talks about how different species populations change over the lifespan of each individual. So, when we talk about R-selected species, they have lots of babies, but the percentage of those, right, this is early loss, surviving decreases really quickly. And so then you have just a few that become mature and then survive into full adulthood. You've got sort of an in-between situation, so rodents, birds, things like that, they're going to be this type 2, they're constant loss. These guys, by the way, the R-selected are type 3, and type 1 are these K-selected species. They really pretty much mostly all survive until they get old and die, right? And so these are the different survivorship curves. So annual plants and most invertebrates, would they have type 1, type 2, or type 3, right? So early loss is type 3, late loss is type 1, constant loss is type 2, and then, or do they all just survive all the time? Well, 4 is a crazy answer. No one has that answer. There's always mortality. But annual plants and most invertebrates will have an early loss. They are all R selected, right? They're typically R selected. So think insects, stuff like that. So what we're really talking about here are life histories, okay? So the life history traits are the age at which reproduction first occurs. Early reproduction means more babies, okay? The frequency of reproduction. If you reproduce more, then you typically have more babies. Now, there's an exception to that because you have to think about within the species. If you're R selected and you reproduce more than once, you're going to have a lot more babies than an R selected that reproduces only once. But an R selected that reproduces once is going to have more babies than a K selected species that reproduces multiple times. Okay, so in the life history traits, sometimes it's important to not compare across like K versus R. The number of offspring is part of the life history trait, the amount of parental care given, and the energy cost of reproduction. Some species only have one reproductive event because they're producing so many offspring, it's sort of a catastrophic event, and they basically don't survive it. Think salmon. Okay, so carrying capacity is not a fixed quantity, but rather a variable determined by many factors. True or false? This is absolutely true. Carrying capacity can change based on all kinds of stuff, and we have balancing factors. We've got the biotic potential. These are things that increase growth, and then we've got environmental resistance. These are things that decrease growth. So basically, what you're talking about is when you're talking about environmental factors for biotic potential, it's having the right amount of stuff. Right? You're within the range of tolerance. You're within the ideal amount of stuff. Environmental resistance occurs outside the ranges of tolerance, right? So it's too cold, it's too hot, there's too much light, there's not enough light, right? So outside that range of tolerance. When you're talking about the characteristics of the species, biotic potential would be things like high reproductive rate. More babies mean more biotic potential. Less babies means less in biotic potential. Okay? The ability to resist disease means that you have low mortality, growth. If you cannot resist disease, you have high mortality, decrease in growth. Okay, so that's how that works. And the biotic potential is the maximum reproductive rate of any organism, and every organism, every species has a biotic potential. The limiting factors are those resistance. So I think a really good example is that if you had a common housefly that lays 120 eggs in each generation, if you didn't have environmental resistance in 7 generations, you'd have so many flies, but they can't all survive, and there's just not enough resources for them. And that's the resistance part. Now, what you get from these factors all working together are these natural population curves. And there are 4 big kind of patterns that you see. You've got the stable, which is typically your K-selected. You've got your cyclic, which is associated with your R-selected species, and other things too we're going to talk about in just a minute. You've got your eruptive, where you have some event that allows for lots of offspring to be born, but then that event goes away and you go back to the regular population size. The desert bloom is a really good example of an eruptive population curve, because every so many years you get rains in the desert, and when you do this, you get this amazing amount of flower production, right? All these beautiful flowers, but then they're going to die when it starts to dry out, and they're not going to come back every season. They'll only come back when you get that rain event, which is relatively rare. And then of course there's irregular, things are really unstable and crazy. So alright, so humans throughout history have been exempt from the affection of population overshoots and diebacks. Is this true or false? So thinking in terms of that cyclic pattern, going up above carrying capacity and below carrying capacity, and up above carrying capacity and below carrying capacity, have humans done that? I mean, we don't do that now. We're experiencing exponential growth right now. Well, historically, we actually have not been exempt from the effects of population overshoots and diebacks. We were like any other species. So this is actually false. We've been like any other species up until recently, and what we've done is we seem to have extended the carrying capacity. Or we've overshot it and we're waiting for the dieback. We're not really sure where we are in that, so we're going to talk about that more when we talk about the human population. Okay, so let's get back to the cyclic, because I was talking about cyclic in terms of the R versus K, where you had the stable as K and the cyclic as R, but you can see cyclic population growths in all species when you look at just the species. There is a regular fluctuation of every population, and some of the big causes are because of seasonal food shortages, predator-prey interactions, or a combination of those things. And so when you look at like a predator-prey relationship, when the prey are born, if there's food, a lot of food for the prey, then you'll have a lot of prey. Well, if there's a lot of prey, you can support a lot of predators. So those predator numbers will go up. When those predator numbers go up, then they start predating heavily and the prey numbers go down. When the prey numbers go down, the predator numbers will also go down. And then the prey numbers have the opportunity to rebound. When they rebound, you'll get more predators, right? And you get this cyclic cycle. And again, this happens with seasonal stuff too. This is just an example, okay? Now, the population is also controlled by outside factors. There are independent factors and there are dependent factors. So a density independent factor is going to affect the population no matter what size it is, right? And so this is going to be stuff like weather, climate change, natural hazards, right? And then anthropogenic activities. It doesn't matter if you spill some sort of chemical into the water supply, it's going to affect each individual organism regardless of the number of organisms. If you have 5 people or you have 5 million people, the same percentage of people of that population will die, and it has nothing to do with the number. Okay, now population dependent factors, and these are sometimes what we call the more interesting factors because these will change as the population size changes. The amount of food only becomes an issue when you have a population that's larger than your food supply. That's the same thing with water. Competition becomes much more intense when you have more individuals competing. Predation we already talked about. Disease is actually transferred more easily when you have higher numbers, and the same thing with parasites. Disease and parasites work the same way. And so these density dependent factors are some of the big things that we'll be talking about when we talk about the human population and the way that the human population is distributed and the way that the human population is growing. So here is your last question, and that is competition for resources, predation, parasitism, and disease are examples of what kind of population controls? They are density dependent. That was a review question also, so I could put this adorable picture in there. All right, well, if you have any questions, please make sure that you ask them at the beginning of class, and that is it for these notes, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.